Welcome back to the V Movement. Thank you so much for tuning back in after our longer than expected break. 2025 is going to be even better as we continue to learn more and more about women's health. This year, we have more interviews with experts in the field of pelvic health and can't wait to share this information with you. So, before we dive into our amazing interview with Atavia Minutus today, Sarah and I wanted to let you know about what we are working on. We are introducing a new class series called the Menopause Masterclass Fitness and Wellness, which will be an 8-week series. So stay tuned for more information to come, and you can sign up on our waitlist to be the first to learn about this course. There will be a link in the show notes, so please make sure to sign up. Welcome to the V Movement, the podcast that's all about pelvic health and getting the V's in your life moving. We are your hosts, Allison Craig, physical therapist specializing in pelvic health,
and Sarah Landis, physical therapist and board-certified women's health specialist. In each episode, we delve into the world of pelvic health, exploring everything from the vulva and vagina to the vagus nerve.
Whether you're looking to enhance your understanding of pelvic health, seeking advice on common concerns, or simply want to join a community that embraces these important discussions, the V Movement is the place to be.
So tune in and let's embark on this journey together towards better pelvic health. Because when it comes to the V's in our lives, movement is key.
Welcome to the V Movement. Today, we are super thrilled to have a very special guest, Atavia Minutus, joining us from the UK. Atavia is a gut health coach and nutritional therapist with a background in psychology and counseling. And her passion lies in helping people navigate and overcome the challenge of irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, empowering them to reclaim their lives. She also hosts an incredible podcast called Gut Reactions, Overcoming IBS and Master Your Gut Health, where she breaks down the often, shitty symptoms of IBS, making them easier to understand and manage anyone on their journey to better gut health. Super excited to have you, Atavia. Really appreciate you reaching out and super excited to talk with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. And I love the little play on words there with the shitty side of IBS. Yeah, so excited to connect on with your podcast as well. And what you're doing is amazing. So
Yeah. And your podcast is so fun and so informative. And you do really make the shitty part of IBS more fun and more understandable, because it is such a complex, and it's not even a diagnosis, right? It's a complex of syndromes or symptoms that doctors have kind of just put into one, or like the ICD-10, what the diagnosis platform is for things. So really excited that you have dedicated like a whole podcast to this. I wanted to start with just, for our listeners to understand, what is IBS? What is irritable bowel syndrome? If you can give a little definition on that.
Sure. I mean, IBS it's not like you say, it's not a disease. It's a disorder, but it basically is an umbrella term. It kind of encompasses lots of different types of symptoms, and you'll need to present with different types of symptoms to reach the the clinical threshold, I guess, of being like, yeah, you've got this disorder. But the thing is, the symptoms can present so differently in different people. So it could be lots of loose stools, it could be lots of bloating or flatulence, or it could be constipation, or basically, if you just break it down into like super basic terms, your bowel is irritated. And that's why I like to say, people, like, if you've got IBS, if your bowel is irritated, you might not know what by, or it may be irritated in a different way to somebody else with IBS, but it's irritated and you can feel it.
Yeah. So just a lot of potential discomfort. And you mentioned too, like, right, it can be, I think a lot of times, at least when I first thought of irritable bowel syndrome, I think of diarrhea or, really painful stools, and just like, yeah, you're constantly going to the bathroom. But there's also that constipation piece, which, a lot of people don't think of as being irritable bowel syndrome as well. So yeah, it can be a variety of symptoms that people can have. So I thought the first thing that would be really good to talk about is why IBS is caused, and like what are some of the, you mentioned like 4 real and common factors that often get overlooked by the medical professions, just because this is a subject that we don't get a lot of education on. So yeah, if you want to take it away.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, you'll speak to different people and you might get different answers. And this is so based on my clinical experience and my personal experience with IBS as well. And the 4 things that I tend to see in pretty much everybody I work with. And the first one is the gut microbiome. So like the bacteria that are living inside your gut and all the different commensal bacteria there. The second one is food intolerances or sensitivities. Those two things are slightly different. Gut inflammation, so like your gut literally being inflamed. And then the final one is stress. And stress is one that it always surprises me just how much it impacts people's IBS. Like I've worked with people who, as soon as they resolve their stress and they reduce their stress levels, their IBS instantly improves. Some people, not so much, but it has such a massive impact on your gut. For so many different reasons. I know that you guys talk about the vagus nerve, and obviously that's connected to the gut. And there's so many ways that we could go into how stress has such a massive impact, but it's something that a lot of people overlook because it sounds a little bit woo-woo to some people. Or, oh, how can an emotion cause that? These horrendous symptoms. But those tend to be the four things that I see time and time again, and that tend to kind of be overlooked by most medical professionals.
Yeah. And sometimes especially with the stress piece, a lot of people, doctors will just kind of blanket statement, oh, well, you're under a lot of stress, right? And it kind of feels like dismissive,
Yeah.
that it's all in your head. And,
Mhm.
there is very real things that happen because of stress, but learning how to manage it in a way that's like, no, it's not dismissive. This really is
Mhm.
a part of like your increased cortisol levels really do change not only your gut biosystem, but I mean, everything, right? If we're
Mhm.
in that constant fight or flight mode, our body is just not going to process and digest things
Yeah.
effectively, and also like with letting the pelvic floor muscles relax and all of that. So that's huge, and I think that's a hard thing to talk about as medical practitioners because we don't want people to feel dismissed, but
Mm.
it is a big piece of that. So let's start with the first one. You mentioned gut microbiome. And for people who haven't really researched, I mean, I know this word is kind of thrown out there. I see it a
Yeah.
lot on like social media, like, oh, address your gut microbiome. And
Mhm.
what does that mean? And is there testing, or how does somebody know if their gut microbiome is the cause or part of it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your gut microbiome, it's basically the abundance of microorganisms you have living inside your gut that we need to keep us alive, because we're like 90% cells and bacteria. If we didn't have those, we'd die. There's a really good book called 10% Human, which is like only 10% of your cells are human.
Mm,
So we need that, and that's a really good thing to have. But your gut needs a very specific balance of all the different types and strains of bacteria. So the best way to find out if you have any imbalance of bacteria or you have parasites or anything like that in your gut, which can be quite common, is to do a stool test. And I really recommend Genova Diagnostics, are really good
mm,
for that. But yeah, to do a really comprehensive, in-depth stool test, not necessarily ones that you get through medical professionals. They only tend to look for disease producing things. So lots of people will have stool tests at their doctors and say, oh, everything was fine, it can't be my gut microbiome. But they don't look at everything because they can only do so much, right? They're only looking for kind of
right.
disease state, but they don't go and look at absolutely everything. So a lot of people could have, some of your listeners might have tried probiotics before and thought, oh, that didn't really make any difference. But it depends on what's going on in your gut. So you could have an overgrowth of a really pathogenic bacteria and you take the probiotic and it doesn't help, or you could have an undergrowth of a beneficial bacteria, and then if you took a certain probiotic it could help. But it's very specific, so it's not just a case of your gut microbiome is either good or bad. It's such a complex interplay of different bacteria and different things that are living inside your gut. And yeah, it can be a bit more complex than I think it's made out to be.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned, yeah, exactly. When you go to the medical provider, they only have a certain amount, like very small amount of time. I know you've
Yeah.
mentioned like in the UK, you get 10 minutes, which is really 2 minutes.
Hmm.
And depending
Yeah.
on who the practitioner is. And then it's similar here in the United States. I mean, I feel like, yeah, if you go with an insurance-based model, yeah, you're only getting 15 minutes with the
Mm.
doctor, if that. And then the rest of the time they're writing documentation. They only have so much that they can test. And then we're also limited by what insurance will pay for. Um,
Of course.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
like
think
exactly how in depth they'll go. And so big thing that like how people would know if their microbiome, like the first recommendation is to get further testing that's a little bit more comprehensive.
yeah.
Yeah. And then there's also SIBO, the
Mhm.
small intestinal overgrowth bacteria.
Mhm.
I said that opposite.
It's
Small
fine.
intestinal bacterial overgrowth,
Yeah.
which is a breath test. And so
Mhm.
is that also an indicator of microbiome? Is that different?
SIBO is generally treated a little bit differently. It's a little bit harder to basically to treat or to kind of remedy because of where it is, because it's in a different location of the intestine. So generally, if you do have a diagnosis, or if you can call it that, of SIBO, it's a little bit more difficult to work with because it's a little bit more difficult to budge, and yeah, just the way that it's collinated in the gut, it can make it harder to kind of shift. With IBS, it can be as simple as I've literally had clients who've had IBS for years and years and years, and then they have just cut out a certain food and they've taken a kind of very basic broad spectrum probiotic and they feel fine. With SIBO, it can be a little bit more difficult than that, just because of the way that it colonizes. So yeah, they tend to be looked at quite differently.
Okay. Yeah. So gut microbiome, more of a stool test. And so then you also talked about food intolerances. And so oftentimes, like here in the United States, I feel like you've mentioned this too, the FODMAP diet is sometimes what people do, which is a pretty intense diet, right? Food restriction, really challenging because it's like a 3-month process, right?
Different people use it differently. And something that I've actually done an episode on why following a FODMAP diet forever is actually could make your IBS worse, or it could actually, be less beneficial for your gut, because FODMAP that's a diet that's great to indicate if something's going on inside your gut in terms of what foods can you digest. Are they fermenting and causing gas? Because if you take all those foods out for 2 weeks and then you notice that your flatulence, your bloating's gone, and your stools are regulating, cool, it means that there's something going on in your gut microbiome. But the issue is if you use FODMAP diet, a FODMAP diet long term, it's not sustainable. Like I don't know how anyone could keep that up, all those foods out of the diet forever. And B, you end up just starving the bacteria that need those foods anyway. So really, the FODMAP can be used as an indicator of, okay, there's something going on in your gut. Maybe you're lacking certain bacteria that need to process these foods, and that's why they're fermenting. But long term, yeah, I would never be able to do that personally, and it's not really recommended.
Right. Okay. So using it more as a diagnostic, like, okay, that was what we noticed was increasing your symptoms. So cutting out that specific thing, or knowing which probiotic would be a good probiotic for you, kind of thing.
So looking at like, oh, your gut's probably lacking the ability to digest those foods, and that's why they're fermenting, rather than having it as like a long term. And I think this is a thing with having people who are really frustrated, and we don't have a lot of access to sort of information that's easy to understand. And so you read something like FODMAP, and I just noticed that when you have something like IBS or, pelvic issues or whatever it might be, and it's so difficult to understand what's going on, and you read something that you think looks good, you think that's going to be like the quote unquote cure. But actually, I try and make IBS really simple to understand, but it is also a bit intricate in terms of how you manage it, because it's not just a case of removing foods or taking a probiotic. It can also be a case of like the mindset. What time are you eating? Are you eating really late at night and then going to sleep? Your gut's not going to be able to digest, and then you wake up bloated. So it's very unique for each person. But yeah, I feel like I went on a bit of a tangent there.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's so complex. Yeah, it's not just the foods you eat; it's when you eat them and how your body processes, and that's exactly. I know that's something that we talk about in pelvic. When I'm working with people for pelvic floor PT, just especially with the gut stuff. Like, okay, when are you eating? Are you eating consistently, starting in the morning to help that peristalsis process? And so that's a perfect thing to recognize. Like, yeah, when are you eat? What time of day? The mindset piece, and that's simple and very hard to do at the same time when we have these behaviors that we do for decades that we started as a kid, and then now we're having to shift that can be simple yet very hard to do. But that's great, just recognizing like there are simple things that you don't have to take medications for and have all the other side effects of the medications, that there are a lot of lifestyle behavior changes that you can do to help with those symptoms. So that was the second one. You talked about food intolerance. What was the third one again?
So third one's inflammation, and that tends to come from some of the other ones. So you can have, I notice people who tend to be a bit more inflammatory in terms of maybe if you have, say you have a lack of certain bacteria in your gut, some of the bacteria in your gut are really supportive of your gut lining, and it will help to regenerate your gut lining, keep it healthy, keep it, protected, feed the mucosal membrane. If you lack certain bacteria, say you don't eat a certain type of food and you don't feed that bacteria, that can then deplete and you can get more of an inflammatory response. Or if you're eating lots of foods that you're not realizing you're intolerant to, or you have a bit of a sensitivity to, that can just make your gut a little bit inflamed. So that's the third one. But it tends to be triggered mainly by one of the other three, or kept going by one of the other three.
Yeah. So same thing again, kind of noticing when you're like lactose intolerant is kind of the big thing, which people can become lactose intolerant, right? It's not
Oh,
something
so
that
common.
you're necessarily born with. It can change when you go, like people post menopause or while they're perimenopause, that can be a change in their gut microbiome, or the way that their body processes foods changes. And so that can be a really hard thing for people to figure out, or to, because they weren't intolerant. And so they just
Yeah.
keep on eating the same foods. And then it's like, oh, okay, we do have to kind of go through like a little bit of a food diary to figure out what is causing the irritation. So in those instances, it's easy to say like, oh, just cut that out. But easy, but people
Yeah.
love ice cream or cheese or
Yeah.
whatever, especially here in the States. I don't know if it's like that in the UK, but
Yeah, I think people love cheese. Everybody says to me when I see them in clinic, I couldn't give up cheese. I'm like, well, I've got some bad news for you, looking at your food intolerance results then. But I think it's with something like lactose, people aren't prepared that you probably will stop producing lactase, the enzyme that breaks it down, at some point in your life. And people go through their lives. And I mean, I suddenly got lactose intolerance when I was in my early 20s, I think it was. And luckily I was able to pinpoint what it was. It was quite obvious to me, but some people it wouldn't be. And so it's quite confusing and quite jarring when you suddenly just start getting these gut symptoms and you think, I haven't changed anything. And something I say to people who ask me about IBS, or, it suddenly came on, I don't know where it came from, or, it just came on in my 30s or whenever. I'll just say, have a think about what was happening around that time in your life. Was it that you just finished like college and you were really stressed, and you just started a really highly stressful job, or you had a bad breakup or something like that? Or was it like nothing changed, like nothing at all changed? There's no stress, there's no difference in what I was eating. Then I say to people, okay, there was no medication used, like antibiotics. Maybe then that could have been a food intolerance that was going to happen at some point and then just suddenly came on because you exhausted your lactase reserves, basically, and then you got lactose intolerance. Or gluten is another one. So something I like to say to people, just get curious about your symptoms and also when they started, because that can be a good indicator of what probably the trigger was.
yeah, I love that you use that word curious. That
Mm.
is big, because so many
Yeah.
times there's a lot of fear
Mm.
involved, and kind of just a lot of shame sometimes, or like, it's my fault, it's my fault. And so then we get in this like, it's a mindset thing of like, oh gosh, what did I do to myself? And more of like, let's get curious about it. Curiosity is huge. So that's awesome. I love that
Definitely.
word that you use.
Yeah, I love it. And also not like, if you're like, what have I done wrong? And also, like I say to people, your gut isn't out to get you. When you're like, why is my body doing this? Like, your body isn't out to get you. It's just it's something's going on that's telling you. But I think you can just so easily get into that, why are you doing this? And you end up kind of being frustrated and kind of fighting against the reality of the situation. But as soon as you get curious, that can help you to kind of look at it in more of a neutral stance and see, okay, if I'm approaching it with curiosity, let me figure out what's going on and work with my body, rather than feeling like, you're battling it all the time,
You're
because that's exhausting.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's so many aspects of our lives where we do that, right? Especially like with pain, when I see people who are like, oh, I can hike, I can do all the things, but then all of a sudden my knees started bothering me. And now, yeah, exactly. It's out to get me, and
Yeah.
I can't do anything. But this is what I want to do. So I'm going to keep on doing it. And
Hmm.
yeah. So just like recognizing like, oh, curiosity. What did my body telling me? Like saying, hey, we don't enjoy this, or we have to have a
Yeah.
little bit more maintenance, or a little bit more deep dive on like, what can we do to help. So that's a awesome way and a good segue into number 4, which was the stress part, right?
Mm. Yeah, major.
Um,
Stress is so huge, and it can affect your whole, I mean, obviously it can affect your whole body, right? But the thing is, I was thinking earlier about how when you look at an animal, for example, my cat, if she gets a fright or something makes her jump, like I drop something, she suddenly has this burst of adrenaline and cortisol, and she'll like run away, and then she'll be like, oh, everything's fine now, and I'll just go back to sleep. As humans, I feel like we rarely do that. We're always in at least a very low grade level of stress all the time. Even if it's just in my head, I know I have an appointment in an hour, or my phone pings, or we're always aware of the next thing, and we're always in a very low level state of stress. And if you're hearing this and thinking, no, I'm not, that means you're just used to it. Like, just
mhm.
means that you've just become accustomed to that level. And that's not natural or normal for our bodies, but the society we live in now, has just made it normal. And I think if you think about the gut, I mean, in terms of acute sudden onset stress, that can definitely trigger digestive issues. You know, it moves your blood away from your gut. It just really compromises your ability to digest foods. But long term as well, like if you have cortisol going through your system constantly, can kill off certain levels of bacteria, and then you can get, microbiome, die off, and it's just not the one. Stress is not the one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's like, good stress and stresses that are not great, right? We do need that stress because yes, we want to get out of dangerous situations, but
Yeah.
in this day and age, we're not running from lions and tigers, at least not in the States, maybe a bear, but really bears don't attack unless you're in grizzly territory. But yeah, so we're constantly just like, yeah, exactly. All the little things that add up, like you said, like the pings, the notifications, like constant, like needing for attention. We go on Instagram or whatever the social media, and there's just constant chatter that's going on, which amplifies and continues that cortisol level within our brain. And like you said, it can change the way that our gut microbiome is and change the way that our inflammation response, because it gets quicker and quicker when we're in that constant stress state. It gets quicker at noticing it and sets off all these alarms. And then it's just constant alarms going off because it's seeing the rise in cortisol level, because rise in cortisol level is dangerous. We don't want to have a stroke or a heart attack. So our body is really hyper vigilant in noticing cortisol levels. And when we have that constant state of increased cortisol, it affects all things. So that's huge. So sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say something that I think we always forget is that you can't just go from stressed to not stressed. You have to almost be actively relaxing, and especially if it comes to the vagus nerve. And I did a couple of episodes on this where I was talking about vagal tone. One of my friends said, like, what are you on about vagal tone? It's like toning up a muscle. How can you tone up a nerve? I'm like, listen, go do the research, it's there. But say you go to the gym and you want to tone up, you got to go and do that again and again and again, right? And with the vagus nerve, it's kind of similar. Like the more you meditate or you just actively relax your nervous system with deep breathing, or even just being aware that you're stressed and then releasing tension from your body, the more you do that, the more you have a good vagal tone. So I've got a friend who is so jumpy. She jumps at everything. And I'm like, your vagal tone is poor. You need to, because she's always in the stress state. So it just makes you, like you say, more prone to stress. If something happens, you're more sensitive to it, almost like it impacts you more.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just like like you said, it's like when you go work out, you're toning your muscles in the same way we have to tone our brain and practice it. And I know so many people have, like, when they think of meditation, they're thinking of monks and people who are just like total in Zen state, and you have to sit there for an hour and not think about anything, when in reality, we're having constant thoughts all the time. And like, it's cool. Like for me, if I can do 30 seconds of like letting go of those things, then great. But it's really, and this is where maybe mindset and meditation are different, but noticing the thoughts come in, but being curious, like, and but not perseverating on it, or not like going down those things. Just notice that thought came in, acknowledge it, and see if you can let it just float away or whatever. So that's something that I notice when I mention meditation to people. There is a kind of an aversion of it, like, well, I can't dedicate an hour or two of my time to meditate. Like, it can be as simple as like you said, as far as like the breathing, just taking a couple of deep breaths when you're noticing you're stressed. And just practicing that throughout the day. And then, like you said, it becomes easier and easier to help at least decrease that constant cortisol state and the vagal tone, which is really cool that we're getting more and more information about the vagal tone, because I feel like, I don't know, I think maybe in the 70s or 80s, that was something that started, and then it was kind of like quackery. So it's cool to see like how things start to actually be like, oh no, there's actually things that are going on here now that we have more ability to research it, or at least more open mindset.
And it empowers people to be like, oh, I can just do this for my vagus nerve. You have the empowerment then. You have the knowledge and the information. You can do it. You don't have to go and pay, I don't know, a really expensive therapist or something. If it's just, these are things that you can just do first and empower yourself, and then you can manage it yourself. And who doesn't want to be empowered around their own health, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, take it for yourself. You really do have to be somebody who can own your health, own your body, know your body, and do the research and do the work. And notice that you don't have to spend all the money to be able to do the things, and just take some of those quick tools to use it. Although sometimes it is helpful to at least get somebody to start with and have that
100%.
conversation and have that breakdown. And so to help have that one-on-one time can be really beneficial. And that's where coaching is really helpful, because,
Yeah.
sometimes it's hard to get out of our own head. We just constantly are seeing things. And so having an outside perspective where people can actually take the time, because that's the other piece, like medical system, they don't have the time or the education on learning how to take people through noticing their day and noticing their stress levels. And that's where coaching is really helpful. And I know you do coaching, help with that nutrition side of things, and also just helping people realize their mindset and how that all changes their perspective and what's going on in their body.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that's my aim, is to help people see them for a couple of months and then they can go on their way. Like, they don't have to keep coming back, or, you just give people the tools to be able to manage it, and then they can manage it themselves. I think that's such a nice thing to be able to do, and to see the changes it makes for people, and then just seeing people not having to worry or think about their gut. It's like, cool, I know I just need to do this, this, and this. And if I have a flare up, I know what I need to go back to, and I can just live my life and not have to worry about it all the time. It's
That's
just, yeah, so nice.
yeah, not having to worry about where the next bathroom is, or
Yeah.
yeah, I think you had in your earlier episodes, you talked about dating with IBS
Mm.
and
Oh, yeah.
how that can be really challenging. And I loved that episode. I thought it was great. You had a lot of
Oh, thank
good,
you.
just general dating advice too. Anybody who doesn't have IBS, it's like, oh yeah, that is really, find a place that is comfortable for you to go, and that you could have an out, or you can pick what foods you go to versus letting the other person figure out where they want to go. So I
Yeah.
loved that. Was a great episode, and it was
Oh,
nice.
thank you.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you would like people to know about your work, or anything else about irritable bowel syndrome that you would like to touch on before we end today?
No, I just think that if you're experiencing something that's going on with your gut, or maybe you don't even have IBS, or you have something but you're not quite sure, I would just say the most important thing I've seen with people is just to be accepting of where you're at rather than where you want to be. Because
Mm,
so I'm sure you see this all the time with people with health problems. You just want to not be experiencing that thing. But the more that you do that, the more frustration you build, the more stress you get, usually the worse your symptoms are. And you end up just fighting against yourself. And it just takes you out of that curiosity mindset. And it's just a really frustrating place to be. But if you're accepting of where you're at, and some people, I'll say, the reality of your situation is you do need coaching and you do need to see a specialist, because if you don't, your situation is quite complex and you probably won't be able to figure out on your own. Other people will be, well, let's just start with a few basics, like you don't have to see a coach yet, but just being realistic of where you're at, because that actually puts you back in the empowerment seat of, okay, what decisions do I need to make based on the reality of my situation? Is it that I need to just try, you know, breathing and relaxing before I eat and seeing what reducing my stress does? Do I just need to have 12 hours away from food where I don't eat so close to bedtime, so I'm giving my gut time to actually heal itself while I'm asleep, rather than just going to bed on a full stomach and that's causing more discomfort, and then you wake up in the morning with loose stools or something like that. Yeah, so I would say just be realistic with yourself where you're at, and what the next step is that you need to do to get to where you ultimately want to be.
hmm Acceptance doesn't mean giving up, I think, is a big thing
Absolutely.
too, right?
Yeah.
There's a great quote by Michael J. Fox, who has Parkinson's, right? Acceptance doesn't mean giving up. It just
Mhm.
means it is what it is, and there's got to be a way through it. So that's a great reminder, reducing some of that fear that's around it, and also that
Mm.
desire of, well, this is where I was and now I'm here. Sometimes we need that. It is a
Mhm.
grieving process of noticing how it's a grief of like, oh, this is where I was before, and now
Mm.
this is something new and a different chapter in our lives, but it doesn't have to be this devastating chapter. It's just a new turn of the page, and this is where we're at, and how is
Yeah.
my journey going to go from here? So that's a
Yeah.
great reminder. So yeah, we'll post in the show notes information to your podcast and also to your website. And I know you've got some programs that you do as well. So um, do you have Instagram? I haven't looked it up. Or
Yeah, I do have Instagram. I'm mainly on the podcast, but yeah, I've put
okay.
my handle as well in the show notes. If anyone wants to follow me, come and look at some IBS memes, something like
Love it.
that.
Make it a little more fun, right?
Yeah. IBS is hard enough as it is. We don't want to have it all serious.
Right, right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Atavia. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it's been awesome to talk with you. And thank you for reaching out.
Thank you so much. It's nice talking to you.
Reminder to get on the waitlist for the Menopause Masterclass Fitness and Wellness series. You can also reach us at info@thevmove.com or on Instagram at thev.movement. I highly recommend checking out Atavia's podcast, Gut Reactions. And until next time, keep the V's in your life moving. The information shared in this podcast by Sarah, Allison, and our guest interviews are intended for educational, entertainment, and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While we are licensed physical therapists, we are not your personal physical therapists, and no patient-provider relationship is formed. If you have any health concerns or questions, please consult your medical provider. The information on this podcast or any of our other platforms is to use at your own risk.